Somewhere in the Caribbean around 1718, a ship called the Queen Anne's Revenge sat low in the water. Not because she was taking on waves, because she was carrying 40 cannons. 40. On a vessel that was never designed to hold more than 26. The man who ordered those extra guns bolted to the deck was Edward Teach. You know him as Blackbeard. And the reason he crammed that ship with more firepower than a Royal Navy frigate had nothing to do with bravery, nothing to do with sword fighting, and nothing to do with the Hollywood version of piracy you grew up watching. It had everything to do with one brutally simple calculation. The ship with more cannons wins. Every single time. Now picture a map of the Atlantic world in the early 1700s. You have the coast of West Africa on the right, where European slavers and merchant vessels loaded up with gold dust, ivory, and human cargo. Trace your finger left across the ocean and you hit the Caribbean, a shattered archipelago of islands stretching from Trinidad in the south all the way up to the Bahamas. North of that, the American colonies, Charleston, Boston, New York. And connecting all of it, thousands of miles of open ocean with no law, no Navy patrols, and no protection whatsoever. This was the world's most profitable shipping corridor. Spanish treasure galleons hauled silver from Portobello. English merchantmen carried tobacco and sugar from Barbados. French traders moved rum and molasses out of Saint-Domingue. Dutch cargo ships ran spices through Curaçao. Every single one of those routes passed through the same bottleneck, the Windward Passage between Cuba and Hispaniola, or the Florida Straits between Havana and Key West. And waiting at those bottlenecks, anchored behind small islands and hidden in shallow coves, were the pirates. Blackbeard near Ocracoke, Charles Vane off Nassau. Calico Jack, Rackham prowling the coast of Jamaica. Samuel Bellamy working the shipping lanes off Cape Cod. Bartholomew Roberts terrorizing everything from Brazil to Newfoundland. Every one of them understood the same truth. The cannon was not a weapon. It was the entire business model. To understand why, you have to forget everything you think you know about pirate combat. The movies show you two ships pulling alongside each other, crews swinging across on ropes, swords clashing on deck. That happened occasionally, but the vast majority of pirate engagements were decided before a single boot touched the enemy deck. They were decided by gunpowder, iron, and the terrifying mathematics of a cannon broadside. A standard naval cannon of the early 1700s fired a solid iron ball weighing anywhere from 4 to 32 pounds. The most common gun on a pirate ship was the 6-pounder or the 9-pounder. Smaller than what the Royal Navy preferred, but there was a reason for that. Pirates didn't want to sink ships. They wanted to capture them. A 32-pound ball fired at close range would punch through both sides of a merchant vessel and send it to the bottom. A 6-pound ball would shatter the rigging, kill a few crew members, and leave the cargo floating. That distinction matters more than anything else in the story of pirate warfare. Every tactical decision, every cannon placement, every type of ammunition loaded into the barrel was governed by one principle: destroy the crew's will to fight without destroying the prize. And the cannon was the perfect instrument for that job. Let's talk about how these weapons actually worked, because the mechanics explain everything about pirate tactics. A smoothbore muzzle-loading cannon from the Golden Age of Piracy was, at its core, a bronze or iron tube sealed at one end. You poured black powder down the muzzle, about 2 to 3 pounds of it for a 6-pounder. Then you rammed in a wad of rope fiber or cloth to hold the powder in place. Then the cannonball itself. Then another wad on top to keep the ball from rolling out if the ship tilted. The whole loading process took a trained crew about 90 seconds. On a Royal Navy vessel with disciplined gun crews who drilled every day, you could get that down to 60 seconds. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. On a pirate ship, where the crew was a mix of volunteers, press sailors, and former merchant seamen with varying levels of skill, you were looking at closer to 2 minutes between shots. That loading time shaped everything. 2 minutes is an eternity in combat. It meant that the first broadside was by far the most important. If you timed it right, if you held your fire until you were close enough to guarantee hits, you could cripple an enemy ship before they even got a shot off. And pirates were obsessed with that first broadside. The gun crew itself was typically 4 to 6 men per cannon. One man swabbed the barrel with a wet sponge after each shot to extinguish any burning embers that could ignite the next powder charge prematurely. One man loaded the powder. One man rammed the ball home. One man aimed the gun using a wooden wedge called a quoin to adjust elevation. And one man touched the linstock, a slow-burning match on a stick, to the touch hole to fire. On a ship carrying 20 guns, that meant you needed over 100 men just to operate the cannons. This is why pirate crews were so large. A sloop carrying 10 guns and a crew of 75 wasn't overstaffed. It was barely adequate. You needed men for the guns, men for the sails, men for the boarding party, and men to replace casualties during the fight. Here is something most people never consider. The effective range of a cannon in this era was shockingly short. You could technically fire a 9-pound ball over a mile, but hitting anything at that distance was pure luck. The ball would bounce off the waves, lose velocity, and arrive with about as much force as a thrown rock. The real killing range, the distance where a cannonball would reliably punch through a ship's hull, was about 300 yards. And for accuracy, you wanted to be inside 100 yards. Some pirate captains wouldn't give the order to fire until they were within 50 yards. That is half a football field. At that range, you could see the faces of the men you were about to kill. This is why pirate ships were almost always smaller and faster than their targets. You didn't need a massive warship if your plan was to close distance quickly, fire one devastating broadside at point-blank range, and then board while the enemy was still picking splinters out of their eyes. Speed was more important than size. Maneuverability was more important than armor. And the ability to fire first was more important than the ability to fire more. But the cannonball itself was only part of the equation. Pirates used a variety of ammunition designed for different tactical situations, and understanding those options reveals just how calculated pirate warfare actually was. The standard round shot, a solid iron sphere, was your hull smasher. You aimed it at the waterline if you wanted to sink a ship, which pirates almost never did, or at the gun ports if you wanted to kill the enemy's gun crews. A 6-pound ball traveling at roughly 1,100 feet per second would pass through 18 inches of solid oak. Most merchant ships had hulls about 8 to 12 inches thick. The math was not complicated. Then there was chain shot. 2 iron balls connected by a length of chain. When fired, the balls would separate and spin through the air like a horizontal buzzsaw. Chain shot was designed to destroy rigging, ropes, sails, and masts. If you could bring down an enemy's main mast with a well-placed chain shot, they were dead in the water. They couldn't run. They couldn't maneuver. They could only sit there and wait for you to pull alongside. Bar shot worked on the same principle. 2 half spheres connected by an iron bar. Same spinning action, same devastating effect on rigging. Pirates loved bar shot because it was cheaper to make than chain shot and nearly as effective. Grape shot was the anti-personnel round. Instead of one large ball, you loaded a canvas bag filled with small iron balls, usually about an inch in diameter. When fired, the bag disintegrated and the balls spread out in a cone, turning the cannon into an enormous shotgun. At close range, grape shot would sweep an enemy deck clean of anyone standing. This was the round you fired just before boarding. Clear the deck, then send your men across. And then there was langrage. This was the pirate special. Langrage was any collection of scrap metal, nails, broken glass, musket balls, pieces of chain, or whatever else you could stuff down a cannon barrel. It was devastating against crews at close range and cost absolutely nothing to produce. You just swept up whatever metal debris was lying around the ship and used it as ammunition. There was one more type of ammunition that deserves mention, and it tells you something ugly about the era. Heated shot. Some pirate crews, particularly those operating near shore where they could maintain a fire, would heat cannonballs in a brazier until they glowed red. A red-hot iron ball fired into a wooden ship would embed itself in the hull and set the timber on fire from the inside. It was devastatingly effective against anchored ships that couldn't maneuver away. But pirates rarely used heated shot because, again, the goal was to capture ships, not burn them to the waterline. Heated shot was more commonly used by shore batteries defending harbors against pirates. Port Royal in Jamaica, Fort Charles specifically, maintained heated shot furnaces for exactly this purpose. The choice of ammunition told you exactly what a pirate captain's intentions were at any given moment. Round shot at the rigging meant they wanted to stop you from running. Chain shot at the masts meant they were preparing to board. Grape shot across the deck meant they were about to come over the rail. And langrage meant they didn't care about being elegant. They just wanted bodies on the deck. Now let's talk about the ships themselves, because the cannon didn't exist in isolation. It was part of an integrated weapons platform, and the design of that platform determined who won and who died. The most common pirate vessel was the sloop. Single-masted, shallow draft, fast and maneuverable, a typical sloop could carry anywhere from 4 to 12 cannons. That doesn't sound like much, and it wasn't, but a sloop could sail in water as shallow as 5 feet, which meant it could hide in places where larger ships couldn't follow. It could also outrun nearly anything on the ocean except another sloop. The next step up was the brigantine. 2 masts, deeper hull, room for 14 to 22 cannons. This was the sweet spot for ambitious pirate captains. Enough firepower to take on merchant vessels and enough speed to escape from warships. And then there were the flagships, the vessels that the most successful pirates either captured or modified into floating arsenals. Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge was a former French slave ship called La Concorde. When Blackbeard took her, she had 14 guns. By the time he was done modifying her, she carried 40. He added gun ports, reinforced the deck to handle the extra weight, and turned a medium-sized slaver into one of the most heavily armed ships in the Western Hemisphere. Sam Bellamy's Whydah Galley was another captured slaver, originally carrying 18 guns. Under Bellamy, she ended up with 28 cannons and could outrun almost anything in the Atlantic. When she wrecked off Cape Cod in 1717, she went down with 4.5 tons of gold and silver. We know exactly what she carried because archaeologists found the wreck in 1984 and have been pulling artifacts out of it ever since. Bartholomew Roberts took it even further. His flagship, the Royal Fortune, carried 42 guns and was one of several ships in a pirate squadron. Roberts didn't operate alone. At his peak, he commanded a small fleet, with his flagship as the heavy hitter and smaller sloops as scouts and chase vessels. This was organized naval warfare, not the random plundering of popular imagination. But here's what made the pirate cannon strategy truly brilliant. It wasn't about destruction, it was about intimidation. Consider the typical encounter between a pirate ship and a merchant vessel. The pirate spots a sail on the horizon. They give chase. The merchant captain sees the pirate closing and has to make a calculation. Can I outrun them? Usually the answer was no. Merchant ships were heavy, slow, and designed to carry cargo, not fight battles. Can I fight them? This is where it got interesting. A merchant ship might carry 10 or 12 cannons, but most of those guns were small, 4-pounders or even smaller swivel guns. The crew was not trained for combat. They were sailors, not soldiers. Most merchant crews had never fired a cannon in anger in their entire lives. And even if they had guns and knew how to use them, fighting back against pirates carried a terrible risk. Pirates had a code, and the code was simple. Surrender peacefully and your crew will live. Resist and everyone dies. This wasn't just bluster, it was enforced with absolute consistency. When pirates took a ship that had surrendered without a fight, they typically treated the crew reasonably well. They took the cargo, sometimes took the ship itself, recruited any willing sailors, and let the rest go. But when a merchant ship fought back, the pirates made examples. Crews were tortured, killed, or marooned on deserted islands. The message was clear, and it traveled fast through every port in the Atlantic. Don't fight the pirates. And the cannon was the exclamation point on that message. When a pirate ship pulled within range and ran out its guns, when a merchant captain could count the cannon ports and see the black muzzles staring at him, the psychological effect was devastating. Those cannons represented a promise. Surrender now, or we will reduce your ship to splinters and pick your cargo out of the wreckage. Most merchant captains did the math and struck their colors. Some historians estimate that as many as 3 out of 4 pirate captures happened without a single shot being fired. The cannons won the battle just by existing. But when combat did happen, it was horrific. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds, grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. The Battle of Cape Lopez in 1722 is one of the best documented pirate engagements in history, and it shows exactly what cannon warfare looked like in practice. Bartholomew Roberts, arguably the most successful pirate of the Golden Age, with over 400 ships captured during his career, was anchored at Cape Lopez off the coast of Gabon when HMS Swallow appeared on the horizon. The Swallow was a Royal Navy warship carrying 60 guns. Roberts had 42 on the Royal Fortune and additional guns on his consort vessels. But Roberts made a critical error that morning. His crew was drunk. They had captured a merchant ship the day before and had been celebrating all night. Captain Challoner Ogle of the Swallow used a clever tactic. He sailed past the pirate fleet as if he hadn't noticed them, drawing one of Roberts's smaller ships, the Ranger, out in pursuit. Once the Ranger was separated from the fleet, Ogle turned and engaged. The Ranger's crew, badly hungover and undermanned, fought for 2 hours before surrendering. Ogle then returned for the Royal Fortune. Roberts was killed in the opening exchange. A blast of grape shot caught him full in the throat while he stood on deck in his finest clothes, a crimson damask coat, a diamond cross on a gold chain, 2 pistols on a silk sling. His crew, following his standing orders, threw his body overboard before the Navy could take it as a trophy. Without their captain, the pirates fought on for another 3 hours. The cannons traded broadsides at close range, splintering wood, shattering bodies, filling the air with smoke so thick that gun crews couldn't see the ship they were shooting at. The noise alone was almost unbearable. A single cannon firing produced a sound comparable to standing next to a thunderclap. Now multiply that by 40 guns firing in sequence, the concussion waves bouncing off the water, the screaming of wounded men, the cracking of timber as cannonballs punched through the hull. Sailors who survived cannon engagements often suffered permanent hearing loss. Some were knocked unconscious simply by standing too close to a gun when it fired. The physical toll on the ship was equally catastrophic. Every cannonball that struck the hull didn't just make a hole. It blasted a spray of wooden splinters in every direction. These splinters, some of them 2 feet long and sharp as spears, caused more casualties than the cannonballs themselves. Surgeons aboard naval vessels during this period reported that the majority of wounds they treated were not from iron shot, but from oak fragments driven into flesh at high velocity. There was no treatment for a 12-inch splinter embedded in a man's abdomen. You pulled it out, packed the wound, and hoped. When the pirates finally surrendered, the Royal Fortune was a wreck. Her masts were shattered, her hull was riddled with holes, and the deck was slick with blood. 169 pirates were captured, 52 were hanged, the rest were imprisoned or sold into servitude in the gold mines of West Africa. It was the largest pirate trial in history, and it effectively ended the Golden Age of Piracy in the Atlantic. And every bit of it was decided by cannons. But the story of pirate cannons doesn't end with the Golden Age. The weapons themselves became artifacts, evidence of a world that existed for barely 50 years but reshaped global commerce, naval warfare, and international law forever. When the wreck of the Queen Anne's Revenge was discovered off Beaufort, North Carolina in 1996, divers found over 30 cannons still sitting on the ocean floor. Some of them were English, some were Swedish, some were French. Blackbeard's arsenal was a collection of captured weapons from 3 different empires, each one taken from a different prize ship and added to his growing floating fortress. The Whyda's cannons told a similar story. Mixed calibers, mixed origins, mixed manufacturers. Pirate ships were not equipped by any government or navy. They were armed piecemeal, gun by gun, capture by capture. Every cannon on a pirate ship represented a previous victory, a ship taken, a crew overwhelmed, a captain who chose surrender over destruction. Those cannons also reveal something about the economics of piracy that often gets overlooked. Guns were expensive. A single 9-pound cannon in the early 1700s cost roughly 60 pounds sterling. Adjusted for modern values, that's somewhere around $15,000 per gun. A ship carrying 20 cannons was carrying the equivalent of $300,000 in weaponry alone, not counting the gunpowder, shot, and maintenance costs. This is why the most successful pirates were not lone wolves. They were essentially running small military operations with significant overhead costs. Crew had to be paid, ships had to be maintained, ammunition had to be replenished, cannons had to be cleaned, inspected, and occasionally replaced when they cracked from repeated firing. The pirate captain who couldn't keep his guns working was a dead pirate captain, and the gunpowder itself was a constant logistical headache. Black powder in the Age of Sail was made from saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur, mixed in a ratio of roughly 75 to 15 to 10. It had to be kept absolutely dry, which was almost impossible on a wooden ship surrounded by salt water. Wet powder didn't fire. Damp powder fired weakly, and improperly stored powder could explode spontaneously, which actually happened with disturbing regularity. Pirates stored their powder in the magazine, a sealed compartment deep in the ship's hull, below the waterline. The magazine was lined with copper sheeting to prevent sparks and was accessed through a narrow passage called the light room, where a lantern behind thick glass provided the only illumination. The gunner, the man responsible for the ship's weapons and ammunition, was one of the most important officers on any pirate vessel. A good gunner could mean the difference between a successful broadside and a catastrophic misfire. There is one more dimension to the pirate cannon story that rarely gets told, and it changes how you think about the entire era. The cannon didn't just decide individual battles, it decided the geography of piracy itself. Think about where pirates operated: the Caribbean, the West African coast, the Indian Ocean, the Straits of Malacca. These weren't random locations, they were choke points, narrow passages where shipping lanes converged and merchant vessels had no choice but to pass through concentrated areas. Pirates chose these locations because cannon range was limited. You couldn't control the open ocean with smoothbore guns that were only accurate at 100 yards. But you could absolutely control a narrow strait, a harbor entrance, or a coastal passage. The cannon's limited range turned geography into a weapon. If you positioned yourself at a choke point with enough guns to cover the passage, every ship that came through was in your kill zone. Nassau in the Bahamas became the pirate capital of the Atlantic, not because it was beautiful or strategically important to any empire, but because it sat right on the shipping lane between the Caribbean and the American colonies. Ships heading north from Jamaica or Havana had to pass within a few miles of Nassau. Pirates anchored there could spot sails from the harbor and be in cannon range within an hour. Madagascar served the same function for the Indian Ocean pirates. It sat on the route between the Cape of Good Hope and the rich trading ports of India and the Middle East. Pirate captains like Henry Every and Thomas Tew used Madagascar as a base to intercept Mughal treasure ships carrying gold, gems, and silk from Surat to the Red Sea. The South China Sea pirates, particularly the massive fleet commanded by Qing Shi in the early 1800s, controlled the narrow waters between mainland China and the islands of Southeast Asia. Qing Shi's fleet reportedly numbered over 300 junks and 1,800 smaller vessels, carrying thousands of cannons collectively. She essentially established a toll system: pay the pirates or lose your ship. The Qing Dynasty Navy tried to stop her and failed so completely that the government eventually offered her amnesty and a pension just to make her stop. In every case, the cannon was the mechanism of control, not the sword, not the pistol, not the boarding party. The cannon. It was the tool that allowed a few hundred outlaws to hold entire oceans hostage and extract tribute from the most powerful empires on Earth, and the empires eventually figured out the only solution: more cannons, bigger ships, professional gun crews. The Royal Navy's response to the pirate threat was not to build faster ships or train better swordsmen. It was to build ships carrying 60, 70, even 100 cannons, crewed by men who drilled on their guns every single day. A first-rate ship of the line, like HMS Victory, carried 104 cannons and could fire a broadside weighing over half a ton of iron. No pirate vessel on Earth could survive that. The Navy also changed tactics specifically to counter pirate strategy. Instead of chasing pirates across the open ocean, they stationed warships permanently at the choke points pirates depended on. The Jamaica Squadron patrolled the Windward Passage. The African Squadron covered the Gold Coast. Governor Woodes Rogers brought 3 warships to Nassau in 1718 and gave every pirate in the harbor a choice. Take the king's pardon and go straight, or hang. Most took the pardon. The ones who didn't, like Charles Vane, were hunted down and executed within 2 years. The Navy also began using intelligence networks that would have impressed modern spy agencies. Merchants who had been captured and released by pirates were debriefed about pirate ship strengths, crew sizes, armament counts, and planned movements. This intelligence was shared between governors, admirals, and ship captains across the Atlantic. Pirates who thought they were operating in obscurity suddenly found warships waiting for them at their next planned anchorage. The pirate era ended not because pirates became less daring or less numerous. It ended because the major naval powers invested in cannon technology that pirates simply could not match. A 40-gun pirate flagship was terrifying to a 10-gun merchant ship. It was a floating coffin against a 100-gun man of war. By 1730, the Golden Age of Piracy was effectively over. The last major pirate captains had been killed, captured, or pardoned. The shipping lanes of the Atlantic were patrolled by warships that outgunned anything pirates could field. And the cannon, the weapon that had made piracy possible, became the weapon that ended it. There is a strange irony in that. The same technology that allowed a few hundred men to challenge global empires was the same technology that those empires used to crush them. The cannon didn't pick sides. It served whoever had more of them. And in the end, empires will always have more. Today, those cannons sit in museums. The ones from the Queen Anne's Revenge are in a conservation lab in Greenville, North Carolina. The Whyda's guns are displayed in Provincetown, Massachusetts. Others are scattered across maritime museums from London to Kingston to Cape Town. Each one is a piece of industrial hardware, bronze or iron, weighing between 500 and 3,000 pounds. Designed to do exactly one thing, hurl a metal sphere at high velocity into the side of another ship. But what they represent is bigger than their function. They represent the moment when a handful of outlaws, using the same technology available to kings and admirals, held the wealthiest nations on Earth to ransom. Not with ideology, not with politics, not with religion, with cannons. The weapon that decided every pirate battle in history was never romantic. It was loud, brutal, and indiscriminate. It killed with splinters as often as with the ball itself, sending shards of oak through human bodies like wooden shrapnel. It deafened the crews who fired it. It filled ships with choking sulfur smoke. It could misfire and kill its own gun crew without warning. But it worked, and for one brief, violent, extraordinary period of history, it allowed the poorest sailors on the planet to become the richest outlaws the world had ever seen. That's the story of the pirate cannon, not a sidearm, not a tool. The entire foundation of an outlaw empire that spanned 3 oceans and terrorized a dozen nations. And every single cannon they fired was stolen from somebody else.